Be me, Jolene. I guess I was 24 at the time, maybe just turned 25, living in an apartment with my two best friends, Annabella and Livia. We were more than friends. We were a unit, a support system. Our apartment was our sanctuary, a little corner of the world where we didn't have to deal with the constant background noise of male entitlement. We had posters on the walls, books on the shelves, all reinforcing what we knew to be true about the world. It was a good setup, the three of us against the world. Annabella was the youngest, the true believer. Her heart was always in the right place, even if she was a bit naive. Livia was the pragmatic one. She understood the system and how to navigate it, always thinking 2 steps ahead. And I was the anchor, the one who kept our ideology strong, who reminded us why we were doing this. We worked retail and service jobs, paid our bills, and spent our evenings talking, decompressing from the daily frustrations. Every day felt like a small battle, 1,000 tiny aggressions we had to endure from male customers, male managers, just men in general. Our home was the only place we could let our guard down. Then the trouble started. It was subtle at first, a missed shift here, reduced hours there. The cost of everything was going up, and our paychecks weren't. We started cutting back, eating cheaper, canceling subscriptions. But it was like trying to patch a dam with chewing gum. The financial pressure just kept building. I remember the day the first notice came. It was a polite but firm letter from our landlord, Amanda, reminding us the rent was late. We pooled our money and paid it, but we knew it was just delaying the inevitable. The next month, we were even shorter. That's when Amanda showed up in person. She wasn't a bad person, just a businesswoman. She had a mortgage to pay, and our personal struggles weren't her problem. She stood in our living room, arms crossed, and laid it all out. The message was simple. The rent was late again, and she couldn't afford to let it slide. She told us we had 2 options. Either we'd be evicted at the end of the month, or we could find a 4th person to take the empty bedroom and cover the shortfall. We were devastated. The idea of bringing a stranger into our safe space was horrifying. Annabella was almost in tears, talking about how it would ruin everything. Livia was already running numbers, trying to find a way out, but the math just wasn't there. I argued with Amanda, tried to reason with her about our situation, but it was like talking to a brick wall. She told us she didn't care who we found, as long as they passed the background check and paid on time. She gave us a week to decide. That week was miserable. We posted ads online, looking for another woman to join us. The responses were few and far between. The ones who did reply were flaky or just didn't seem like a good fit. The deadline was approaching, and the panic was setting in. Then Amanda called me. She sounded pleased with herself. She said she had found a tenant for the empty room. I felt a wave of relief, and I asked her to tell me about the person. There was a pause on the line. Then she said the applicant's name was Johnny. I asked if she meant a woman, like Johnny with an ah. She laughed. Nope, Johnny, as in a man. I felt the blood drain from my face. I told her absolutely not. No way. We would not live with a man. It was completely out of the question. Amanda's tone turned cold. She informed me that he had already passed the background check, had a stable job, and was ready to pay the deposit and first month's rent immediately. She said under the Fair Housing Act, she couldn't discriminate based on gender. She then delivered the final blow. Her exact words were something like, "Either you accept him as a housemate, or I accept his application to rent the entire apartment after you're all evicted." She had us. She knew she had us. It was a checkmate. We could either share our sanctuary with a man or lose it entirely. I hung up the phone and told Annabella and Livia. The mood was funereal. Annabella actually started crying, saying she felt violated already. Livia was furious, but her anger was directed at the system, at our financial reality. She saw it for what it was, a trap. I felt a cold, hard rage building inside me. This was it. This was the patriarchy in action. Even in our own home, we were being forced to accommodate a man because of money and power. We spent the next couple of days in a state of dread, waiting for him to arrive. We decided that if we were being forced into this, we would set the terms. We would be in control. The day he moved in, we were all waiting in the living room. Amanda brought him by to sign the final papers. He was not what I expected. I guess I was picturing some loud, obnoxious bro type. But Johnny was quiet. He looked tired. He was wearing work clothes, jeans, and a plain t-shirt with sturdy-looking boots. His hands looked rough, like he worked with them. There was grease under his fingernails. He didn't say much, just nodded and gave one-word answers to Amanda's questions. He didn't really look at us. It felt like he was actively trying to take up as little space as possible. This didn't make me feel better. It felt like an act, a trick, a way to seem non-threatening before revealing his true nature. After Amanda left, we called him into the living room for a house meeting. He stood in the doorway, not wanting to come all the way in. I was the spokesperson. I held a piece of paper in my hand. I told him that for this arrangement to work, we needed to establish some ground rules to ensure our home remained a safe space. He just watched me, his face impassive. I started reading from the list we had prepared. We called it the roommate agreement. First, he was not to initiate conversations with us. If we needed to speak with him, we would speak first. Second, he was not allowed to have guests over, especially male guests. Our home was not going to become a frat house. Third, his time in the shared bathroom was to be limited to 10 minutes in the morning. We had schedules to keep. Annabella added that he needed to keep the toilet seat down. Always. He just nodded slowly. Then I got to the final point. I explained that living in a shared space required an acknowledgement of systemic privileges. Therefore, on top of his third of the utilities, he would be required to pay a small patriarchy tax of $50 a month. I explained this was to compensate for the extra emotional labor we would have to perform living with a man, and for his disproportionate use of shared resources created through historically gendered labor. I was specifically talking about the washing machine and the kitchen appliances. Livia had come up with that part. It was brilliant. I expected him to argue, to get angry, to show his true colors. That's what men did when their privilege was challenged. But he didn't. He just stood there for a moment, looking from me to Annabella to Livia. Then he let out a quiet sigh. He said, "Okay," just like that. No fight, no argument. He asked if that was everything. I was so taken aback I just nodded. He took the paper from my hand, went to the kitchen counter, signed his name at the bottom, and handed it back. Then he went into his room and closed the door. We were stunned. We had won. It was that easy. Annabella thought maybe he was just scared of us, of our unified front. Livia figured he was just desperate for a place to live, and would agree to anything. I thought it was a sign of his guilt. He knew he was an intruder, an oppressor, and he was willing to pay the price. We felt powerful. We had taken a bad situation and turned it to our advantage. The first week or so was weirdly quiet. Johnny was like a ghost. He would leave for work early in the morning, before any of us were up. He would come home late in the evening, go straight to his room, and stay there. We would sometimes hear him moving around, but he never made much noise. He used the kitchen late at night, after we had all gone to bed. In the morning, the only sign he'd been there was a single clean plate and fork in the drying rack. He followed all the rules perfectly. It was almost unnerving. The $50 tax was on the kitchen table in cash on the first of the month. We started to relax a little. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. He was basically a silent wallet who paid his share of the rent. We had our space, and he had his. The two never overlapped. We continued our lives as before, having our nightly discussions, supporting each other. We even started making jokes about our pet man tenant who lived in the back room. The first crack in our perfect system appeared about a month in. It started with the kitchen sink. It was draining slowly for a few days, and then, one evening, it just stopped draining altogether. A disgusting pool of murky, greasy water just sat there, refusing to budge. Livia, who was the most sensitive to smells, said we had to deal with it immediately. My first instinct was to call the landlord, but Livia pointed out that the lease said clogs were the tenant's responsibility. Calling a plumber would be expensive. Annabella suggested we just wait. Maybe it would fix itself. I told them we absolutely would not be calling a man to come and fix our problems for us. It was a point of principle. We were independent women. We could fix a simple clogged sink. How hard could it be? So we tried. We tried the plunger. We tried pouring boiling water down the drain. We tried baking soda and vinegar, a trick Annabella found online. All that happened was the disgusting water bubbled a bit and smelled even worse. We spent an hour on it, getting more and more frustrated. Then Livia had an idea. She wanted to try and unscrew the pipe under the sink to clear it out manually. It seemed logical, but the plastic fitting was on incredibly tight. We all tried, but none of us could get it to budge. In our frustration, we started using more force. There was a loud cracking sound, and then the trickle of water coming from the fitting turned into a steady, pulsing stream of the foulest water imaginable pouring directly onto the kitchen floor. We panicked. We were throwing towels on the floor, but they were soaked in seconds. Annabella was freaking out, saying we were going to flood the apartment below us. In our moment of crisis, I did the only thing I could think of. I called Maurice. Maurice was our friend, a fellow traveler in the movement. He was one of the few good ones. He understood the issues, he always listened, and he always validated our feelings. I explained the situation, and he said he would be right over. When Morris arrived, he surveyed the scene with a thoughtful expression. The kitchen floor was now a shallow pond of filth. He didn't look at the pipe. Instead, he looked at us. He started talking about how this was a perfect metaphor for late-stage capitalism. He said the pipes, the infrastructure, were created by a patriarchal system, and it was no surprise that it was failing us. He told us that our attempt to fix it ourselves was a beautiful act of resistance. While he was giving this speech, Livia was frantically trying to bail water into a bucket with a dustpan. I was trying to listen to Maurice, trying to see the bigger picture he was painting, but it was hard to concentrate with the sound of gushing water. That's when the back door opened. It was Johnny, home from work. He stopped dead in the doorway, his eyes taking in the scene. The flooded kitchen, the three of us in a panic, Morris gesturing philosophically. He didn't say a word. His face was unreadable. He looked at the gushing pipe, then looked at us. He walked back out the door. I felt a flash of anger. He was just going to leave? Just walk away from the disaster? Typical male behavior. Avoid responsibility. Morris didn't even seem to notice him. He was now talking about deconstructing the very concept of plumbing. A minute later, Johnny came back in. He was carrying a large, heavy-looking toolbox. He walked past all of us, as if we weren't there. He knelt down in the puddle of water, not seeming to care that his jeans were getting soaked. He placed a bucket under the leak. Then he took out a wrench and, with a single, smooth movement, tightened a valve somewhere that we hadn't even seen. The gushing water slowed to a trickle, then stopped. Silence. The only sound was the dripping from the soaked towels. Maurice had stopped talking mid-sentence. Johnny then went to work on the cracked fitting. He took it off, looked at it, then went into his room. He came back with a small, new-looking piece of pipe and some kind of tape. In a few minutes of efficient, silent work, he had replaced the broken part. Then he took a long, flexible metal thing from his toolbox and fed it down into the open pipe in the wall. He worked it back and forth a few times, pulled it out, and there was a disgusting clump of hair and gunk on the end. He cleaned it off with a paper towel, put everything back together, and then turned the valve again. He turned on the faucet. The water swirled and disappeared down the drain with a satisfying gurgle. The sink was fixed. The whole process had taken less than 15 minutes. He stood up, wiped his hands on a rag. He looked at the flooded floor, then picked up the mop from the corner. He started mopping up the mess, efficiently wringing the mop into the bucket. None of us knew what to say. Morris finally spoke. He cleared his throat and said something about how it was interesting to see traditional masculine roles being performed. Johnny didn't even look at him. When the floor was mostly dry, he put the mop back, picked up his toolbox, and walked towards his room. As he passed, Livia quietly said, "Thank you." He paused for a second, gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, and then disappeared into his room, closing the door behind him. We were left standing in the clean, quiet kitchen. The problem was gone. Maurice tried to start his speech again, but the energy was gone. He made some excuse about having to be somewhere and left soon after. That night, nobody felt like talking. We cleaned up the last of the mess and went to our separate rooms. I lay in bed thinking. I was annoyed. I was annoyed that he had fixed it so easily, without even speaking. It felt like he was showing off, silently mocking our incompetence. It was a display of toxic masculinity, of solving problems with tools and brute force instead of communication and collaboration. But as I was thinking that, a small, uncomfortable thought entered my mind. What had communication and collaboration gotten us? A flooded kitchen and a lecture. His tools and brute force had gotten us a working sink and a dry floor. I pushed the thought away. It was just a fluke. We were just unprepared. Next time we would do better. But I noticed something had changed. Livia was quieter than usual for the next few days, and I saw her watching Johnny sometimes when she thought no one was looking. A tiny crack had appeared in the foundation of our fortress, and I didn't like it one bit. The incident with the sink created a strange tension in the apartment. It was like a question had been asked that no one wanted to answer. Outwardly, things went back to normal, but the dynamic had shifted. Livia was definitely looking at things differently. She stopped making snide comments about Johnny, and when I tried to bring up male incompetence, she would just get quiet and change the subject. Annabella was confused. She was loyal to our cause, to me, but she couldn't ignore what she had seen. She saw a problem, and she saw it get solved. It was simple, and it contradicted everything we believed. I felt like I had to work harder to keep our ideology intact. I tried to frame the sink incident as a learning experience. I said it showed how the system makes women dependent on male skills, and that we should take a basic plumbing course to empower ourselves. Livia just gave me a flat look and asked if we should take an electrical course and a drywall course too, just in case. The sarcasm was obvious. I doubled down, talking more about toxic masculinity, about how Johnny's silent fixing was a form of control, a way to assert dominance without words. Annabella would nod along, but she didn't look convinced anymore. Livia would just leave the room. I felt like I was losing them. The foundation of our little world was cracking. Then, a couple of months later, the real test came. It was getting into late fall, the kind of weather that gets cold and miserable. Rain for days, a damp chill that gets into your bones. One night, I think it was a Tuesday, the power went out. It wasn't just us. The whole block went dark. One moment the lights were on, the next, just blackness and silence. At first, it was kind of exciting. We lit some candles and huddled together in the living room. But the hours dragged on. The apartment, which was old and poorly insulated, started getting cold. Really cold. We could see our breath in the candlelight. We piled on every blanket we owned, but the chill was relentless. Annabella started to get genuinely scared. She hated the cold, and she was worried about how long it would last. Livia was practical, trying to figure out if we had any food that didn't need cooking. The answer was basically crackers and a sad-looking bag of chips. I tried to keep everyone's spirits up, talking about how this was a chance to disconnect from technology and reconnect with each other. After about 3 hours of shivering, my little speech wasn't working anymore. We were miserable and hungry and cold. And of course, someone suggested calling Maurice. He answered on the first ring, full of concern. He said the power was out at his place too, but he promised to come over and bring supplies. We felt a bit of hope. Maybe he'd have a flashlight or some ideas. He showed up about an hour later. The supplies he brought consisted of a bag of kale chips and a single large bottle of kombucha. He also brought his acoustic guitar. He told us that in times of crisis, the most important thing was to maintain spiritual harmony. He suggested we all sit in a circle, hold hands, and meditate on our collective inner warmth. Annabella just stared at him, shivering too hard to speak. Livia looked like she was about to commit a violent crime. I tried to be diplomatic, suggesting that maybe a more practical solution was needed. Morris seemed disappointed in my lack of spiritual fortitude. He then launched into a long monologue about how the centralized power grid was a symbol of patriarchal control, and that this blackout was an opportunity for us to embrace a more decentralized, eco-feminist way of life. As he was explaining this, the door to Johnny's room opened. We all turned to look. He was wearing a thick flannel shirt and holding a small, powerful-looking flashlight. He shone the beam around the room, his eyes landing on the thin, useless candles we had lit. He didn't say anything to us. He just went to the window that faced the street. He pushed aside the curtain and looked out for a moment, then went to the other windows and did the same. He came back to the living room and started running his hand along the bottom of the window frames, where the cold air was seeping in. Then he went back to his room. We heard some rustling, and he came back out carrying 2 old, thick blankets and a roll of duct tape. He went to the draftiest window and started expertly tearing off strips of tape and using them to seal the edges of the old blankets against the frame, creating a makeshift layer of insulation. The effect was immediate. The icy draft that had been chilling the room was cut off. Maurice stopped his speech and watched, a frown on his face. He muttered something about how sealing ourselves in was symbolically problematic. No one was listening to him. After Johnny had sealed all the windows in the living room, he went back to his room again. He returned with a small metal contraption that I later learned was a camping stove. He also had a metal kettle and a few bottles of water. He set it up on the kitchen counter, lit it, and a few minutes later, the sound of a whistling kettle filled the apartment. He found some mugs in the cabinet, spooned some instant coffee into 3 of them, and poured the hot water. He walked over and handed a mug to me, one to Annabella and one to Livia. He didn't make one for Morris. The warmth of the ceramic mug in my frozen hands was one of the best feelings I've ever had. The hot coffee was even better. It was like life flowing back into me. Annabella was cradling her mug like it was a precious treasure, tears of gratitude welling up in her eyes. Johnny then went back to his room one last time. He came out with 2 thick, high-tech-looking sleeping bags. He unrolled them and handed one to Annabella and one to Livia. He just gestured for them to get in. Annabella didn't hesitate. She crawled into the sleeping bag, zipped it up, and let out a long, happy sigh as her body finally started to warm up. Livia followed suit. Johnny looked at me, huddled in my thin blanket, holding my coffee. He didn't offer me a sleeping bag. There was no malice in it. It was just a fact. He had 2, and he gave them to the 2 who weren't the leader of the anti-man club. Then he picked up his flashlight, went back to his room, and closed the door. The living room was quiet, except for the sound of us sipping our coffee. Morris was standing there, holding his guitar, looking completely and utterly irrelevant. He tried to save face. He said something like, "Well, I guess a reliance on fossil fuels and capitalist-produced camping gear is one response to this situation." Livia's head popped out of her sleeping bag. She looked at Maurice with pure contempt. She told him, her voice dripping with ice, that he should probably leave. She said his spiritual harmony was giving her a headache. Maurice was shocked. He looked to me for support. I just looked down into my coffee cup. I had nothing to say. He left, looking wounded and betrayed. The three of us stayed in the living room that night. Annabella and Livia warm in their sleeping bags, me wrapped in every blanket I owned, still cold. The power came back on some time in the middle of the night. But the damage was done. Our ideology had been pitted against a simple physical reality, the cold, and it had failed spectacularly. Morris, our chosen male ally, had offered lectures and kale chips. Johnny, the silent intruder, had offered warmth and practical solutions. The evidence was undeniable. After that night, things were different. The resistance was over. Annabella started being openly polite to Johnny. She would say good morning to him, or thank him if he held a door open. Livia started cleaning up the whole kitchen, not just her part, a silent acknowledgement that he was part of the household now. I was the last holdout. I couldn't bring myself to admit defeat. I just avoided him, staying in my room more, keeping my head down. The tension between me and the other two girls was growing. They were moving on, and I was stuck in the past. The final, humiliating straw came about a month later. It was late, probably after midnight. Livia and Annabella were already asleep. I had been in the living room reading and went to go back to my bedroom. I closed the door behind me, and it made a weird clicking sound. I tried the handle. It wouldn't turn. The old lock mechanism in the handle had jammed or broken somehow. I was locked out of my own bedroom. My phone was on my nightstand. My keys were in my jacket pocket, inside the room. My wallet, everything. I was standing in the hallway in my pajamas with nothing. I tried jiggling the handle. I tried pushing on the door. Nothing. It was stuck fast. A wave of pure, cold panic washed over me. I was trapped. My first thought was that I could sleep on the couch and deal with it in the morning. But the thought of the humiliation, of having to explain to Livia and Annabella how I got locked out, was too much. I quietly knocked on Livia's door until she woke up. She was groggy and confused, but when she understood the situation, she was sympathetic. We both tried the door. It was no use. Livia got her laptop, and my heart sank, because I knew what my only option was. I had to message Maurice. My hands were shaking as I typed out the message, explaining what happened. His reply came a few minutes later. It was not helpful. He started by saying that this was a fascinating psychological event. He wrote, "The door is a barrier, a construct. By being locked out, the universe is forcing you to confront the barriers you've built around yourself. Instead of trying to open the door, perhaps you should try to deconstruct the very concept of what a door is." I just stared at the screen. Deconstruct the concept of a door. I was standing in a cold hallway in my pajamas, locked out of my room, and this was his advice. Livia read the message over my shoulder. She didn't say anything. She just closed the laptop. She looked at me, then looked down the hallway towards Johnny's room. I knew what she was thinking, and I hated it. I whispered, "No, we can't." Livia looked me dead in the eye. Her expression was weary. She looked so tired of me, of my stubbornness. She just said, "Jolene, stop, just stop." Then she turned and walked down the hallway and knocked quietly on his door. It was the walk of shame. My walk of shame. A moment later, the door opened. Johnny was standing there, squinting in the light, clearly having been fast asleep. He was just wearing a pair of gym shorts. Livia explained the situation in a low voice, pointing at my door. He listened, his expression not changing. He just nodded. He went back into his room for a second and came out with something in his hand. It looked like a credit card. He walked up to my door. He didn't even look at me. He slid the card into the crack between the door and the frame, right near the latch. He wiggled it for a few seconds. There was a soft click. He turned the handle, and the door swung open. My room, my safe space. Opened in 3 seconds by the man I had despised. He handed the card back to Livia. He looked at me for the first time, a quick, tired glance. Then he turned around, walked back to his room, and closed the door. The entire interaction had lasted less than a minute. I was left standing in the open doorway of my room, drowning in a sea of my own hypocrisy and humiliation. Everything I believed in, every theory, every argument, had been rendered completely and utterly useless by a jammed piece of metal and a small piece of plastic. That was the end. I had nothing left to fight with. Reality had won. The next morning, the air in the apartment felt different. It was lighter. Livia and Annabella were in the kitchen when I came out. They gave me gentle, sympathetic smiles. They didn't say, "I told you so." They didn't have to. Later that day, while Johnny was at work, I walked over to the wall where we had pinned the roommate agreement. I took it down. Livia and Annabella watched me. I tore it into 4 pieces and dropped it in the trash can. The next day, on the 1st of the month, I left Johnny's share of the utility bills on the table like always. Next to it, I placed a $50 bill. When he got home that evening, he came into the kitchen, saw the money, and paused. He looked at me, and I met his gaze. I just gave a small nod. He picked up the money, put it in his wallet, and went to his room. Nothing was said. It wasn't a truce. It was a surrender. My surrender. Life in the apartment found a new rhythm after that. It wasn't like we all became best friends. It was never going to be that. But it became normal. We coexisted. We were roommates. Annabella would sometimes cook a little extra for dinner and leave a plate for him on the counter. Livia once asked him for help carrying a heavy piece of furniture she'd bought. He did it without complaint. I started just treating him like a person. I'd say hello. I'd ask him if he needed anything from the store. He was always polite, always quiet. He still mostly kept to himself. But it wasn't the hostile silence of before. It was just his way. He was a quiet, hard-working guy who just wanted to be left alone. We had treated him like a monster, a symbol of everything we hated. But he wasn't a symbol. He was just a man, a person. And in the end, his quiet competence and simple human decency had taught us more than all the books and blogs we had ever read. He never lorded his victories over us. He never said a word about the sink, or the cold, or the door. He didn't have to. He had just lived his life, and in doing so, he had dismantled our entire worldview without even trying. It was the most profound and humiliating lesson of my life. We were wrong. It was as simple and as complicated as that. We were just wrong.